Hello and welcome to another podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. This is not a podcast. This is a video where I talk about podcasting. Topic of conversation today is podcasting's hockey stick. Did you know we have one? That's right. Podcasting has its own hockey stick. Let me tell the story the right way. Yesterday, I had to disappoint a client. This client had hired me to analyze his podcast. No, I'm not going to talk about what podcast it is. I'm not being vague. I'm being respectful. He had been podcasting for a little over a year, roughly an episode every couple of weeks-ish. 27 episodes. But things were changing. The company that this client had hired to help him with the podcasting was kind of in over their heads and would no longer be in the podcast production business. So he needed to figure out if anybody else could do this. And of course, the answer is yes, lots of people could do this. I could do this, but we really wanted to understand the whole process. So we broke everything down. Interviews with the people that are working in the show, data from the statistics that we get. Did a full-on analysis. This was a let's really understand what's happening here. And so what I found out was that this show was incredibly complex. Complexity was off the scale. Well, it wasn't off the scale. It was complex, and it was taking a lot of time, like double-digit hours, and that first number wasn't a 1. And when we looked at the reality of doing things, it was like, it's kind of scary. So disappointed. The jury's still out on what we're going to do. But it brought me into this mode of thinking that I want to talk about today. This hockey stick of growth, or hockey stick of complexity versus effort. Now let me explain what I mean by that. So you probably can't see this if you're listening, but if you're watching, you can see I've got a chart, standard hockey stick growth. On the bottom, the left-right axis, also known as the x-axis. On the x-axis from left to right is increasing complexity with very simple shows at the base and very complex shows far on the right side. And on the y-axis, the up and down scale, you'll see I have effort, ranging from not very much at all the way to massive amounts of effort. So what we see is as we increase in complexity, the effort kind of increases, but not a lot, but it does towards the end. The more complex you get, it goes up in a big way towards the end. Now, there's also some writing on this chart, and let me explain that to you. So at the lowest level of complexity, is what I call 2 dorks with microphones. Maybe you have more dorks than that. Maybe you are a single dork. 2 dorks with microphones means the people who just get together around a microphone, hopefully multiple microphones, and talk about random things that come into their head. You know, the staple of podcasting. That which has been the way it worked. Such is life. Such is life. Now, nothing's wrong with those shows, but they take relatively little effort. These are the ones you hear people say, it takes me 20 minutes to produce my show. Okay, great. An hour in the studio, maybe an hour and a half worth of work after that, and boom, podcasting. You're done. Yay. Simple, easy, straightforward. But I think you'll all agree with me. Not the most engaging and energetic of shows. That's the easiest one, 2 dorks with microphones. Very little effort, low on the effort scale, and also very little on the complexity, because it's literally turn on the microphones and talk, right? Now let's go one step over. The big middle ground is what I call the 5-part podcast. The 5-part podcast is that which you have heard, which may also be 2 dorks with microphones, but these are specialized dorks. They know what they're doing. They probably have a script or some sort of a show outline. The interview is the main part of the show. That's part number 1, if you will. There is typically a setup at the beginning of that interview or main piece of content, which is edited, by the way. There's a setup in front of that. There's usually something at the end, a wrap-up, if you will. And then there's typically an intro and an outro, making all of the 5 parts. Canned intro, setup, show content, recap, outro. 5-part podcast. Those can be very simple, done live in real time, or they can be a little more complex. And if you'll notice, if you're looking at the chart, that there's not a big difference. There's a raise slightly to the right because you can get more complex with those. You can add multiple segments, you can add pieces, you can add bits, you can add various things, but they don't necessarily have to increase on the effort scale if they're nicely planned out. So lots of room in the middle for a 5-part podcast, from complexities without a lot of additional effort. Some, but not a huge amount of effort. At the end of that scale, when things start to curve up, when the hockey sticking begins, we get into the realm of what I call a recombinant style of podcasting. So much like the 5-part interview show, or the 5-part podcast, a recombinant style starts out like that. We still have a primary interview or some sort of base content that the show is made from. That is recorded still, that is still captured somehow. But now, instead of making that one contiguous flow, which starts and it ends with maybe edit points in the middle, now we take out individual pieces and we rearrange them. We recombine them with voiceover work to put together a more complex show. And as you will see on the chart, if you're looking at the chart, but if you're listening to me, that ranges from not all that much more complicated than a 5-part podcast to, holy cow, now our effort is trebling or quadrupling. It can be a whole lot more effort, depending if you're putting in sound effects, if you're putting in bed music, in transitional music, lots of things. The more you can make that a lot more complex and still do a show. But where the hockey sticking really begins is the difference between recombinant style and the editorial-driven show. Now, an editorial-driven show is that which starts from an editorial meeting. That's a meeting of the host, the producers, the writers, maybe the guests, and you're planning out what the show is going to be. I have a couple of clients doing this right now. Deep planning. Lots and lots and lots of planning. Then there's a matter of capturing the audio that you think you want, coming back into the studio, figuring out what narrative bits you need to add, not on the fly, but based on the contents that are coming together. You write a script, you go back to the editorial room, and you come back out again, and you start recording. And that takes a lot of time. It's not uncommon for those things to take upwards of 100 hours, which is a significant increase in the effort scale. And an increase on the complexity, but not huge, right? I mean, we're still moving off to the right of the complexity. It's getting more and more and more complex as we do things, but the effort scale goes off there as well. So this is kind of a rundown that I had to give. This is inspired again by the client I had to disappoint yesterday. He was actually trying to do the editorial-driven show. His show began with that big editorial meeting and interviews and conversations, but it was all kind of done in line. So it was, they weren't spending anywhere near hundreds of hours. They were spending double-digit hours, but it wasn't hundreds of hours. And so they weren't in the right frame they weren't in the right effort scale to be as complex as they were trying to be. What's my answer here? Hey, look, make it simple. Make it simple that works for you. I mean, that's why I started my company, Simpler Media, to make things as simple as possible. They don't have to be complex. Maybe you want them to be complex, but make them complex in the right way. Think about your effort. Think about complexity. They all kind of blend together because there will be a hockey scale and one has to work with the other. Hey, if you need help starting your podcast, I launch podcasts. Did I mention that? Podcastlaunch.pro. You can email me, evo@podcastlaunch.pro. I'll be back again tomorrow with another podcast pontifications. Cheers.